This is Radio TV Phono Nut, and some of you may remember this Sonora AM radio and phonograph combination from the late 40s. It's a rather small unit and was a cheapo model, and it's one that we resurrected it some time ago. This started out in life as being having a 78 only phonograph on it, and as you can tell, somebody replaced the drive mechanism and tone arm with a 4-speed mechanism and a lighter weight tone arm for playing newer records. Now, I applaud somebody for wanting to, make this thing a little bit more modern so they could keep using it with more modern records, but I'd sort of like to convert it back to like it was originally as a 78 RPM player. Well, it just so happens I got in a Dynavox 78 RPM cheapo thing. And by the way, everything I've ever seen with a Dynavox brand on it was cheap crap. This one was from 1948. It looked pretty fair, but the more I kept working on it, the more it kept ticking me off, and so I just ended up EOLing the cabinet and pulling what I wanted off of it and throwing the cabinet remains in the trash. It's one of those deals where the parts from that record player will go on to fix other things that are more worthy. And this is the Alliance 78 RPM drive mechanism out of that record player. It's a standard 120 volt motor, thank goodness. It's not a 90 volt like so many of them were. And if this will fit in here, I'm going to put this back in this record player, in this Sonora, and I think we can come up with a brown tone arm that's from the right era and convert this thing back to a 78 only model. I feel like this will fit in here because most of the drive mechanisms used back then were this same Alliance mechanism. And this tone arm and 4-speed mechanism will end up going in something else. You see, we end up using everything for the good of something else around here as much as we can. And yes, this will fit. This hole lines up, this hole lines up, and this hole here, it looks like somebody filled it in with something, but we can remedy that, and this will mount right in here. Alright, I've got the tone arm and the drive mechanism off of the junk Dynavox record player, just sitting on here unmounted. Now, doesn't that look a lot better than what was on there originally? And here's the 3-speed, 4-speed, whatever it is, mechanism, and it's going to need to be rebuilt before I use it in anything. As you can see, the motor mounting grommets are shot, and this rubber drive wheel has cracks all in it. And this looks an awful lot like an Alliance mechanism, the way the mechanism is designed and such, but the motor doesn't look like an Alliance mechanism. In fact, it looks like it might be foreign made. So I don't know who actually made this mechanism, but I've got another little 3-speed suitcase record player that I want to put this in, so that'll come on another day. Okay, original armrest, original tone arm, and original motor that came off of the junked out Dynavox. Doesn't that look a lot better mounted on here than that aftermarket 4-speed mechanism? Okay, here's the chassis out of the Sonora, and with the way the motor off on and radio phono switches are mounted to the motor board, and seeing as how, not so much now because I haven't connected everything up, but from the factory the motor would have been hard soldered to those switches. And even to get the chassis out, you have to remove the phonograph motor because it hangs down too far and prevents the chassis from sliding out. So this particular model and ones like it are not the easiest things in the world to get apart and work on. It would have been a lot easier had they mounted the radio phono and motor power switches here on the front of the chassis instead of on the motor board. And it would have also made it easier had they allowed the motor and the phonograph pickup to be plugged into the chassis, and on better models that's the way it was done. But on these cheaper models, obviously they were cutting cost every which way they could, so if it meant eliminating a couple of plugs, then that's what they did. Alright, just to recap what was done in the old video from a while back. We only replaced what capacitors needed to be replaced, as you can see here. This planet filter capacitor was replaced who knows when, but it's still good. And it is one of the better ones. It's in a metal case with a cardboard jacket on it. The lower end types of capacitors like this, the ones that are just filled with wax or rosin or something, I don't know how they're made, but those are the ones that usually dry out and die. The ones like this in the metal case with the cardboard cover over it usually hold up. Still got two solar seal tight capacitors in here that are in low voltage applications, so even if they were dead short, it wouldn't cause any damage. And it's been my experience that as far as the older paper capacitors go, these solar seal tights are usually check better than any of the rest of them. This one's the volume control coupling capacitor, and this other one is the AVC filter. This green molded Cornell Dublier is the coupling capacitor for the audio output tube. This one that I changed, I think, is the plate bypass capacitor for the audio output tube. This one here is a AC across the line capacitor, and I believe these two are isolation capacitors for the phono cartridge. The tube sockets, as you may recall, were very loose, so I took a small screwdriver and retensioned the pins to give them some extra life. And this chassis actually works pretty good, but the speaker has an issue. I don't know if you can hear it on camera, but the voice coil is definitely rubbing. That could be because of dirt in the gap here. It could be because this cone is warped. But at any rate, I'm going to attempt to repair this speaker, because if I can repair it, that means I won't have to come up with another one to put in its place. And we got a couple of options for doing that. We can put a shim in here between the voice coil and the magnet, and I'll try to find a piece of photographic film to do that. And we can wet this area here with distilled water. We don't want to use regular tap water because it's conductive, and the minerals and whatnot that it contains could cause damage down the road. So wet all this with distilled water, and when everything dries, maybe the cone will reshape and the voice coil won't be dragging. Another possible reason for this is because we have dirt in the gap here, because it appears this speaker never had a dust cap. And one way we can fix that is to connect the speaker to my variable AC power supply and apply a few volts to it, and the 60 cycle vibration of the speaker cone will sometimes work the dust out of the gap, and the speaker will be normal again. But from the way this looks, I don't really think it's a dust issue. I think it's a warpage issue, and I'm going to have to try to shim this up and wet it and see if we can make this speaker perform right. You know, if not, it's no big deal. It's just a 4-inch speaker, but I'd like to save it if possible. Biggest problem is going to be the output transformer, which is mounted to the speaker itself, and these newer speakers don't have provisions for a output transformer mounting, but we do what we got to do. Well, it might have been just dirt. I couldn't find any photographic film, but I found an old computer floppy disk that I cut up and managed to shim a couple of pieces down in between the gap, and when I pulled it out, apparently I pulled some dirt with it, and the The cone is now moving freely without binding, so maybe we got lucky this time. I got a little glue on a tiny rip on the cone. We'll let it dry. Hopefully we can save this speaker. Oh, and let's get a look at what it says here on the dial. Made in the United States of America. And that's something you virtually don't see anymore on consumer electronic equipment. The most common phrase you see now is made in China, and as we all know, that stuff is very much so inferior to this old stuff. I doubt any of this Chinese stuff will be working in 70 plus years, and it certainly won't be repairable. Even as low end as this radio was, it's still functioning and can be fixed all these many decades later.
On Twitter at Bucky Brooks. I'm at Dan Bayer on Fox. Bucky and I sitting in for Doug Gottlieb today here on Fox Sports Radio. Let's head over to the news desk quickly for an update.
Alright, what we're doing, we're playing the radio at a fairly high volume level with the chassis face down, obviously. I think I've got all the debris out of the voice coil gaps, but just to be on the safe side, we're just going to play the radio with the speaker face down, and anything that might be left in there hopefully will be vibrated loose and fall out. So that's what we're going to do. And then once that's done, then we will perform an alignment on the chassis, and then we will concentrate on getting the phonograph to work.
College Football Player of the Year. He becomes the first wide receiver to be so honored since the award's inception in 1998. Thursday's Texas Bowl matchup between TCU and Arkansas has been...
Alright, I did a little cleanup on the cabinet, but it really needs to be refinished. And the dial lens could stand to be replaced. It's a bit on the cloudy side, but that'll be for somebody else to deal with. I'm not doing too much to the cabinet. And the top here looks like something was spilt on it at some point in time that won't come off. And I took my scratch pen here and kind of went over some of the scratches on top to make them less noticeable, but you know, if somebody really wants this thing to look nice, then they're going to have to refinish the cabinet, and that's not my forte. So, like I said, leave that for somebody else.
Wow, man, sprained ankles are absolutely...
We've been on a couple hours. The speaker's sounding good. This 50-something-year-old filter cap is running cool, and that's what we want. And this speaker is freed up now and working like it's supposed to, so that was an easy one to fix up. Unfortunately, not all of them were that easy. Alright, I'm going to try to touch up the alignment here. I'm not even going to pull out the signal generator. I'm just going to find a weak station and do it by ear. Alright, there's a weak station. I might have already done this whenever I played around with this the first time. I don't remember. And I just tweaked the trimmer for the second IF transformer. It's under the chassis here. Okay, I tweaked the trimmers on the tuning condenser and got it a little better. The IFs were pretty well spot on.
I know, obviously for his family.
What's this, bumper music for a talk program? No, that's WABF.
Conversation. I got two Fox squares right out.
That's 670 coming in. Not quite late enough for WSM though.
So you can see him on the
okay.
I'm Dave Beyer. We are sitting in
except for redoing the wires that go to the phonograph pickup and the motor. And that's about all I'm going to do to this radio chassis.
All right, Ralph, what's going down?
Well, Sixers president of basketball operations, Daryl Morey, has been fined.
For a cheapie, it sounds pretty good, but you know how it was back then. Cheap didn't always equate to junk. Now you buy cheap stuff and you got junk, and you buy high-priced stuff and you still got junk. Okay, I just robbed this plug off of an old stereo that I parted out, and we're going to use this to allow easier connection of the turntable motor and the radio chassis. That'll be one less thing that someone has to unsolder. If they have to remove the chassis for service, they can just unplug the motor and not have to unsolder it. And I'm also going to add an RCA jack and plug for the phonograph pickups. That'll be two less things somebody will have to unsolder if they have to remove the chassis for service down the road. I know this won't look exactly like something from the 1940s, but pretty much all we're trying to do with this is resurrect it, so not really too worried about it. Okay, here's the motor connector wired up. And of course, once we put it all back in the cabinet, we'll bundle up all the wiring so it'll look neater. Now we need to address our signal input for the phonograph pickup. Now originally the tone arm wires would have ran through this long spring here and then soldered to the correct terminals on the radio phono selector switch. You may be asking yourself, why do they run the wires through a spring? What's the purpose of that? Well, if you'll look on the other end of this spring here, it's soldered to this lug here, which attaches to the switch, which also attaches to our shield ground on the signal leads going up into the radio chassis. Well, this spring was actually a crude way for them to achieve shielding of the cable that extends from the, or should I say the wires. It's not really a cable, but this provides shielding for the wires that go from the tone arm up to this switch here. And the reason we need shielding is because if we didn't have it, there'd be a chance we could pick up some stray noise which could result in hum in the audio, and this shielding here helps prevent that. Okay, here's our RCA jack attached to some new leads and ran through the spring for shielding, and this chassis is about ready to put back in the cabinet. Only thing left to do electrically is install this RCA plug on the end of the leads coming out of the tone arm, and then if this thing ever has to be taken apart for service again, it'll be a little bit easier to do. All you'll have to do is unplug the tone arm, unplug the motor, and then of course you'll have to dismount the motor in order to get the chassis to slide out. And then there'll be two nuts on the front that hold the switches in place you'll have to remove, and then of course once you drop the switches out of position and undo the bolts holding the chassis to the cabinet and remove the knobs, it'll slide out. But still a process there, but it'll be a little bit easier now with the tone arm and motor being plug-in units.
Because it's corrupted.
Alright, the chassis back in.
Where are people going to go? And so those
are the radio and phonograph. And when you flip it to phono, there's still a little bit of bleed through, so if that bothers you, you might want to tune it to a dead spot on the dial before playing a record. And I'll reach back here and touch the phono input, and I get a signal, so that's good. Alright, motor off, motor on. Phono and radio. Good deal.
who I thought would be higher. Pope Francis. I'm a Catholic, but I am not a Pope Francis guy.
And we're going to put the, we're going to use an 89T cartridge for this, and the reason I have heat shrink tubing over that is to kind of give some strain relief to the leads where they're soldered onto the cartridge connector. I've got to find some appropriate screws to mount this. The original cartridge screws are too long for this, so I'm going to have to find some shorter ones. And tomorrow we'll do a little clean and lube on this mechanism and mount the cartridge holder, and then this thing ought to be ready to go somewhere. There's WSM coming in kind of puny. For some reason it seems like the lower frequencies on the dial come in better in the house, and the higher frequencies come in better down here in the shop, so explain that one.
That is physical or mental.
Welcome back to the Sexton Show. Mike Opelka in for Buck, and he'll be Barry.
Remember the new...
No, it's a job. It's a career.
Greatest American Hero theme. I vaguely remember that show from when I was very young. I think it went off the air when in 82 or 3. I don't even think I was in the first grade when that show was canceled, but I think it was only on for a couple of seasons. It didn't last long. And then in later years I watched shows such as Knight Rider and Dukes of Hazzard and the A-Team and MacGyver and In the Heat of the Night, Magnum P.I., Simon and Simon, and several others. You know, back then TV was still decent, and now I find myself watching no new TV shows. I haven't kept up with a current TV show in probably 25 years or more. Probably the last one I watched was In the Heat of the Night, and that wasn't every week, and when it went off the air in the mid-90s, I was pretty much done with current TV by then, and it's only gotten 10 times worse since then. Alright, I just went ahead and mounted this phono input jack on the back of the set for easy access, and tomorrow, when I'm done working on the tone arm, I'll attach this RCA jack to the leads on the tone arm, and of course we'll shorten these leads as short as possible there, and then our AC for the motor, we'll mount that plug somewhere and bundle these wires up out of the way, and then this thing ought to be ready to roll. And yeah, this is not one that I'm really interested in doing a full-blown restoration on. I've already got more in this than I'd like to have, so fix it with as many junk box parts as possible and try to find it a home. Alright, here's the motor, and I've decided not to do a full teardown of this. It runs pretty good as it is, so I'm just going to give it a light cleaning. Put a few drops of oil on the top and bottom bushings, put a couple of drops of oil on the spindle here. Use some sandpaper to kind of clean up this idler wheel surface. Clean the inner rim of the turntable platter, and that's going to be it. Alright, drive mechanism's back in and working. Now all we need to do is locate some appropriate screws to mount this cartridge holder, and then we ought to be able to play records on this thing. Like I said before, the original screws for the old metal cartridge are too long for this kind of holder. The old type cartridge has a thick body, necessitating the need for longer screws, but with this new type holder we don't need the longer screws, so I've got to find some shorter ones. Okay, we have the cartridge in place, and here's the deal. I could not find any spacers to work with the old screws. I couldn't find any short screws. Or let me put it this way, I wasn't willing to spend 2 hours digging through all my junk trying to find some, so what we did was carefully tighten down the original screws, and it got real tough towards the end, and I was praying every twist that the screw heads wouldn't snap off, but I was able to get them just tight enough to keep that cartridge holder from going wiggle wobble in the tone arm, so it'll just have to do. Like I've already said, this is a resurrection, not a restoration. I'm not patting myself on the back, but I think some of my resurrections are better than what some people's restorations are. But I try to be honest with what I do. I'm not going to just patch something up and claim it to be a full-blown restoration. If it's a resurrection, I'll say so. Alright, let's take it up and fire it up and see if it runs. See if it plays satisfactorily.
After the 10 o'clock curfew, that sounds
like radio.
And master.
Goody, goody, goody.
If you're loving me like I'm loving you, all we're true, I know I still want you.
Alright, there you go. Another one resurrected. So I hope you got something out of all of this mess, and more to come later.
There's his love and mighty he'll stand, waiting to take me to glory land. Mother has gone to welcome me
down to Santa Fe. There's been a lot of changes since I've been away. I went to have a dance at the old dance hall. If winter comes, the skies turn gray, I'll still love you.
Lonely days make one lonely week. 7 lonely nights make one lonely me.
Throw my heart away, makes me dream all day, dream time.
Okay. The year got off to a terrible start when they lost their first 4 games. And those first 4 games were against the Kansas City Chiefs,